Just minutes ago, a quiet royal revelation has set palace watchers buzzing. Reports suggest that Prince William has confirmed something few expected. A private estate once closely guarded by Queen Elizabeth II may now be destined for Lady Louise Windsor. And insiders say the decision has sparked visible tension around Queen Camilla. The secret decision made before the Queen's final years. On the surface, the British royal family has always appeared predictable when it comes to inheritance. Titles pass through bloodlines. Estates tied to the crown move from monarch to monarch. And the public assumes that the most valuable royal assets eventually land in the hands of the future king. But what happened behind palace walls during the final years of Queen Elizabeth's reign appears to challenge that entire assumption. Because long before the world began debating the future of the monarchy under King Charles III, and long before royal headlines became dominated by drama involving younger generations, the late Queen had quietly begun reviewing something far more personal than constitutional power. Her private legacy. Inside Balmoral Castle, the monarch spent increasing amounts of time reflecting on the possessions that had accompanied her through more than 70 years on the throne. These were not state treasures like the crown jewels or properties belonging to the crown estate. Those are institutional assets. They automatically pass to the next sovereign. But Queen Elizabeth also owned something very different. A deeply private estate. It included personal jewelry collections, heirlooms passed down from Queen Victoria, racehorse bloodlines built over decades, investment holdings, and, perhaps most intriguing of all, properties tied to the royal family not as monarchs, but as individuals. And unlike Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, those personal assets belonged to the Queen alone, which meant she alone could decide where they would go. Royal wills are famously secretive. For more than a century, the wills of British monarchs have been sealed from public view for decades after their death. The reason is simple. The monarchy prefers to avoid public disputes over inheritance. But secrecy often breeds speculation. And inside royal circles, whispers began circulating even before the Queen's final months. Those whispers suggested that Elizabeth was not simply dividing her private possessions according to rank. She was choosing based on something else entirely. Trust. To understand why that matters, you have to look at one of the quietest figures in the entire House of Windsor. Lady Louise Windsor. The daughter of Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, has spent most of her life far from the intense spotlight that follows other royal grandchildren. Unlike the children of Prince William or Prince Harry, Louise rarely appeared in headlines growing up, and that was by design. Her parents made a conscious decision to raise their children with as much normalcy as possible. Louise attended school without constant press attention. She worked a summer job at a garden center. She entered university like any other student her age. To many observers, she appeared almost invisible within the royal hierarchy. But inside the royal household, her story looked very different. Because Louise shared something unusual with both of her grandparents. A deep personal bond. At Balmoral Castle, the Queen's beloved Scottish retreat, the atmosphere has always been less formal than in London. During summer stays, the royal family walks through forests, hosts picnics near the River Dee, and spends evenings watching television together like any other household. It was in those quiet moments that Queen Elizabeth and Lady Louise became particularly close. Palace staff occasionally noticed how relaxed the Queen seemed when Louise visited. The monarch, who spent most of her life surrounded by ceremony, appeared able to drop the weight of duty in the presence of her granddaughter. There were long walks through Balmoral's gardens, afternoons spent discussing books, and quiet family evenings where the Queen was simply grandmother, not the sovereign. For Elizabeth, who had lived under global scrutiny since childhood, those moments carried enormous emotional value. But the connection between Louise and her grandparents actually began under far more dramatic circumstances. When Louise was born in 2003, the pregnancy ended in a frightening medical emergency. Her mother Sophie suffered a placental abruption, a life-threatening complication requiring an emergency cesarean section. Both mother and baby faced serious risk. Prince Edward was overseas at the time, unable to reach the hospital immediately. Inside Buckingham Palace, the news reached the Queen with unusual urgency. For several tense days, doctors monitored the premature newborn in a neonatal unit while the royal family waited anxiously for updates. When the tiny infant finally stabilized, the relief inside the royal household was immense. Family members later recalled that Queen Elizabeth followed Louise's recovery closely, requesting constant updates from palace aides. From that moment onward, the Queen appeared to develop a particularly protective affection toward her granddaughter. And the early challenges didn't end there. As Louise grew older, doctors diagnosed her with esotropia, a condition causing one eye to turn inward. The issue required multiple corrective procedures during childhood. While the treatments eventually succeeded, they meant Louise spent parts of her early years undergoing hospital visits and surgeries. Once again, the Queen watched closely. To many royal insiders, those early struggles strengthened the emotional bond between grandmother and granddaughter. But another relationship soon became equally important. One that would shape Louise's future in ways no one expected. Her connection with Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The Duke had spent decades mastering the demanding sport of carriage driving after arthritis forced him to give up polo. What began as a hobby evolved into a serious competitive discipline. Philip studied the mechanics obsessively. He helped design modern competition carriages. He represented Britain internationally. And inside Windsor Great Park, he maintained workshops filled with carriages, harness equipment, and carefully trained ponies. When young Louise began showing curiosity around the stables, Philip noticed immediately. Unlike many children who treated the animals as novelties, she asked questions. She observed carefully. She wanted to understand how everything worked. The Duke decided to teach her. Their lessons soon became a regular part of family visits. Hours were spent practicing on long gravel paths through Windsor's parkland. Philip taught her how to control the reins, how to balance the carriage during turns, and how to remain calm when horses accelerated across uneven ground. It was not casual play. It was serious training. And over time, the quiet granddaughter developed real skill. By the time Louise began competing in youth carriage driving competitions, spectators noticed something remarkable. She wasn't treated simply as a royal participant. She was respected as a genuine driver. When Prince Philip passed away in 2021, the symbolism of that relationship became visible to the entire world. During his funeral procession, his specially designed carriage followed behind the ceremony. Placed on the seat were deeply personal items. His driving cap, his leather gloves, a whip used during training sessions, and a small container of sugar cubes for the ponies he loved. To those who understood Philip's life, the message was clear. Carriage driving had been one of his greatest personal passions. And within the royal family, there was one person chosen to carry that passion forward: Lady Louise. In the months that followed, many of Philip's carriage driving tools and equipment were quietly placed in her care. It wasn't simply inheritance. It was a passing of tradition. And for some royal observers, that raised a fascinating question. If Prince Philip trusted Louise to continue one of the most personal parts of his legacy, could Queen Elizabeth have made a similar decision about her own? Because inside royal families, objects are rarely just objects. They are signals. Signals about trust, about legacy, and about who the monarch believes will quietly protect the spirit of the dynasty long after the throne itself passes to someone else. And according to emerging whispers inside royal circles, the Queen's final decisions about her private estate may have carried exactly that kind of message. A message that, if confirmed, could explain why Prince William's recent revelation has reportedly sent shockwaves through certain parts of the royal family, including one very powerful figure: Camilla. The quiet bond that changed the royal legacy. Long before discussions about inheritance began circulating inside royal circles, something far more important had already been developing quietly within the family of Queen Elizabeth II. It was not about wealth. It was not about titles. It was about trust. Because while the public often focused on the more visible members of the monarchy, the Queen had formed a uniquely close relationship with one granddaughter who rarely appeared in headlines: Lady Louise Windsor. To many people following royal news, Louise remained one of the least discussed members of the younger generation. She was not part of the direct line to the throne, and she grew up largely outside the intense media spotlight that surrounded other royal children. But inside the royal household, her story was very different. The bond between Elizabeth and Louise began forming during some of the most difficult moments surrounding Louise's birth. In 2003, her mother, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, suffered a serious medical emergency known as placental abruption. The condition forced doctors to perform an emergency cesarean section. For a short period of time, both mother and baby faced serious risk. At the time, Prince Edward was overseas on an official trip and could not reach the hospital immediately. Inside Buckingham Palace, the news reached the Queen quickly, and family members later recalled that Elizabeth followed every update about the newborn's condition closely. Louise was born prematurely and required careful monitoring in a neonatal unit during the first days of her life. Those early complications left a lasting emotional impression on the Queen. Family members would later describe how Elizabeth paid particular attention whenever Louise visited during family gatherings. Over time, that protective affection developed into a quiet but meaningful bond. Part of that connection came from timing. By the time Louise was old enough to participate in extended family holidays, many of her older cousins, including Prince William and Prince Harry, had already entered adulthood and begun taking on public responsibilities. That generational gap meant Louise often spent more relaxed time with her grandparents. And there was one place where that relationship grew especially strong: Balmoral Castle. Every summer, the royal family retreats to the Scottish Highlands, where life operates very differently from the formal routines of Buckingham Palace. At Balmoral, the royal household becomes noticeably more relaxed. Family members take long walks through the forests. They picnic near the River Dee. Evenings are spent watching television together rather than attending official events. In that quieter environment, Louise appeared completely at ease. She developed a passion for drawing and often spent hours sketching animals she saw around the estate: deer, birds, and rabbits that wandered through the Balmoral grounds. When the Queen noticed this interest, she reportedly allowed Louise to view some of the personal sketchbooks once used by Queen Victoria during her own visits to the Highlands. For a monarch who valued history deeply, sharing such personal artifacts carried emotional meaning. But the most influential relationship Louise developed during those years was with another royal figure: Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. After arthritis forced him to give up polo, Philip dedicated himself to the sport of carriage driving. What began as a hobby gradually became a serious competitive discipline. He studied the mechanics of carriage design. He helped modernize competition vehicles. He even represented Britain in international events. Within royal estates such as Windsor and Balmoral, Philip maintained workshops filled with carriages, harness equipment, and specially trained ponies. When young Louise began showing curiosity about the stables, Philip noticed immediately. Unlike many children who simply enjoyed seeing the animals, Louise wanted to understand how everything worked. She asked questions. She watched handlers prepare the harnesses. She studied how the carriages were balanced and controlled. Philip saw potential. Soon he began teaching her personally. Their training sessions took place in Windsor Great Park, where long gravel paths allowed them to practice carriage driving safely. Philip approached the lessons with the same discipline he brought to every challenge. Louise learned how to guide the ponies using subtle movements of the reins, how to maintain balance during sharp turns, and how to remain calm when the carriage accelerated across uneven ground. These were not casual rides. They were structured lessons led by someone who had spent decades mastering the sport. Over time, Louise developed real skill. By the time she began entering youth carriage driving competitions, observers at the Royal Windsor Horse Show noticed something unusual. She was not treated merely as a royal participant. She was respected as a serious driver. That relationship between grandfather and granddaughter eventually produced one of the most emotional moments in recent royal history. When Prince Philip passed away in 2021, his funeral procession included a special tribute to the sport he loved. His custom-built carriage followed the ceremony. Placed carefully on the seat were several personal items: his driving cap, a pair of leather gloves, a whip used during training sessions, and sugar cubes for the ponies he worked with. To those who understood Philip's life, the symbolism was powerful. Carriage driving had been one of his greatest personal passions. And within the royal family, there was now one person clearly continuing that tradition: Lady Louise. Following Philip's passing, much of his carriage driving equipment remained in her care. The decision represented more than a simple inheritance. It was a transfer of knowledge, tradition, and responsibility. Louise later returned to competition using one of Philip's own carriages, a moment that reportedly moved the Queen deeply as she watched from the sidelines. For Elizabeth, the scene represented something important: Continuity. A new generation carrying forward traditions that had defined earlier decades of royal life. And that continuity may help explain why conversations about the Queen's personal legacy eventually began pointing toward the same quiet granddaughter. Because if Prince Philip trusted Louise to preserve one of his most cherished passions, it raised a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the Queen believed Louise possessed the same qualities needed to protect something even more significant: her private legacy. And as speculation about Elizabeth's personal estate began circulating within royal circles, the idea that Louise might inherit more than anyone expected started to seem less surprising. In royal families, inheritance is rarely just about money. It is about the message a monarch leaves behind. A message about who they believe will quietly safeguard the traditions of the dynasty. And for Queen Elizabeth, that person may have been someone the world barely noticed. Lady Louise Windsor. The palace reaction no one expected. Inside the British royal family, inheritance decisions rarely remain completely private. Even when official documents are sealed and palace aides maintain strict discretion, information has a way of circulating quietly through the inner circle. And when whispers about Queen Elizabeth II's personal legacy began reaching senior members of the royal household, the reactions were not the same everywhere. For some, the idea that certain private possessions might eventually pass to Lady Louise Windsor seemed entirely reasonable. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions. Because within royal dynasties, inheritance has never been just about wealth. Every brooch, every heirloom, every piece of land carries a deeper message: the monarch's personal judgment about who should protect the family's legacy. And Elizabeth's judgment had always followed one clear philosophy: loyalty first, discretion second, duty above everything else. After more than 70 years on the throne, the Queen had observed several generations of relatives navigating the pressures of royal life. Some adapted well to the role. Others struggled under the weight of expectation. By the final decade of her reign, Elizabeth had developed a remarkably sharp understanding of which members of the family represented stability, and which ones complicated the monarchy's public image. One household in particular stood out: the family of Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Compared with other royal branches, Edward and Sophie's life unfolded with unusual calm. Their marriage remained steady. Their public duties were performed without drama. Their charitable work rarely produced sensational headlines. Over time, Sophie especially became one of the Queen's most trusted allies. Before entering the royal family, she worked in public relations, giving her a clear understanding of how media narratives shape public perception. Once she married Edward, she gradually transitioned into royal duties and developed a reputation as one of the monarchy's most reliable working figures. The Queen valued that consistency. Palace insiders frequently described Sophie as someone Elizabeth trusted completely, someone who approached royal service with professionalism but without seeking attention. That trust naturally extended to how Edward and Sophie raised their children. Unlike some royal households where privilege can create distance from ordinary life, Edward and Sophie made deliberate efforts to keep their family grounded. Their home at Bagshot Park became known inside royal circles as one of the most balanced environments connected to the monarchy. Louise and her younger brother grew up understanding both the privilege of their heritage and the importance of normal experiences. Louise attended school alongside non-royal classmates. She worked a summer job at a local garden center. She later enrolled at university with the same expectations as any other student her age. For the Queen, those choices carried deeper meaning. Elizabeth believed strongly that members of the royal family should remain connected to the everyday lives of the people they represent. Growing up entirely surrounded by privilege could weaken that connection. But Louise seemed to avoid that trap naturally, which meant that when speculation about the Queen's private inheritance began circulating, many royal observers believed Louise's name appearing in those discussions was not surprising. However, the situation inside the palace was more complicated, because inheritance also intersects with the delicate hierarchy of royal status. By the time Elizabeth passed away, King Charles III had already begun shaping his vision for the monarchy's future. His concept of a slimmed-down royal family emphasized a smaller group of senior working members. At the center of that future stood two figures: Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. Their growing responsibilities and strong public support positioned them as the central pillars of the next generation. Within that framework, most royal observers assumed Elizabeth's personal heirlooms would gradually strengthen that core line. Historic jewelry would move toward Catherine. Symbolic items tied to monarchy tradition would remain close to the future king. But whispers suggesting that certain private possessions might pass to Louise introduced a different dimension. Because Louise occupies a unique position inside the House of Windsor. She is close enough to the royal bloodline to carry its traditions, yet far enough from the direct line of succession to remain free from intense political scrutiny. For centuries, monarchies have depended on figures like that. Quiet custodians of family tradition. Individuals who support the institution without competing for the throne. To many observers, Louise fit that description perfectly. But there was one figure whose position made the inheritance whispers particularly sensitive. Queen Camilla. Camilla's path into the royal family had been complicated. For years she remained one of the most controversial figures connected to the monarchy because of the historical tensions surrounding her relationship with King Charles III during the era of Princess Diana. Over time, however, public opinion gradually softened. Camilla committed herself to charitable causes and quietly supported Charles through decades of royal duty. Eventually, Elizabeth publicly expressed her wish that Camilla should one day be known as Queen Consort. That moment signaled acceptance. But acceptance did not necessarily determine inheritance. Elizabeth had always maintained a traditional perspective regarding royal heirlooms. Items connected to generations of Windsor women often moved through direct bloodlines rather than through marriage. That meant younger female royals, particularly Catherine and possibly Louise, naturally appeared in discussions about the future of Elizabeth's personal jewelry and heirlooms. For Camilla, that dynamic created a delicate situation. As Queen Consort, she occupies one of the most visible roles in the monarchy. Yet when it comes to deeply personal royal heirlooms, tradition does not always place her at the center of distribution. Which is why speculation surrounding Louise carried such intrigue. If certain possessions or estate elements were quietly directed toward her, they would represent something more meaningful than wealth. They would represent the Queen's personal confidence. Confidence in a granddaughter who had never sought the spotlight. And that possibility changed how many royal watchers began looking at the quiet young woman who once spent her summers sketching animals in Balmoral's gardens. Because if the whispers are even partly true, the late monarch may have been shaping her private legacy in a way that few people outside palace walls ever expected. Not by rewarding the loudest voices in the royal household, but by trusting the quietest one. And if that interpretation proves correct, it raises a fascinating question about the future of the Windsor dynasty. Because the young woman who inherited Prince Philip's passion for carriage driving may now be quietly carrying something even more important. The Queen's personal legacy. And in the next part of this story, the focus turns to an even bigger mystery. Because if Lady Louise truly holds a piece of the Queen's hidden estate, what role might she play in the future direction of the royal family itself? Why the Queen's quiet choice may reshape the future of the royal family. If the reports surrounding Queen Elizabeth II's private inheritance decisions are even partially accurate, they reveal something far more significant than a simple transfer of wealth. They reveal how the late monarch viewed the future stability of the royal family. Because after 70 years on the throne, Elizabeth had learned one critical truth about monarchy. Institutions survive not only through power, but through character. And character was something she observed very carefully within her own family. During the final decades of her reign, the royal household experienced several moments that tested public confidence in the monarchy. Media controversies, personal conflicts, and shifting public expectations placed enormous pressure on the institution. Through all of that turbulence, Elizabeth repeatedly emphasized one guiding principle. The monarchy must remain steady, not dramatic, not reactive, steady. That philosophy shaped many of her decisions about how the next generation should gradually step forward into royal life. At the center of that future, of course, stands Prince William. As the heir to the throne, William represents the next stage of the Windsor dynasty. His role, alongside Catherine, Princess of Wales, is widely seen as the foundation upon which the modern monarchy will depend. But history shows that kings rarely carry the institution alone. For centuries, monarchies have relied on supporting figures, trusted relatives who quietly reinforce royal duties without competing for attention. In many ways, that was exactly the role played by Elizabeth's own sister, Princess Margaret, during the early years of her reign. Later, figures like Princess Anne and Prince Edward provided similar stability behind the scenes. They were not the monarch. but they helped sustain the monarchy. And that historical pattern is one reason royal commentators have begun paying closer attention to Lady Louise Windsor's place within the family. Because Louise embodies several qualities that the late Queen valued deeply. First, discretion. In an age where public figures often seek attention, Louise has consistently avoided the spotlight. Despite being the granddaughter of one of the most famous women in history, she grew up largely outside the global media glare. Her childhood was intentionally private. Her education followed a traditional academic path. And even as an adult, she appears far more interested in learning and personal development than in cultivating celebrity. For Queen Elizabeth, that restraint would have been extremely appealing. The monarch believed that royal dignity depended heavily on the ability to remain composed under scrutiny. Members of the royal family were expected to represent continuity and calm even when public attention intensified. Louise's personality naturally reflects that approach. Second, tradition. Few younger members of the royal family share as strong a connection to one of Prince Philip's greatest personal passions, carriage driving. Through years of training with Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Louise developed not only technical skill but also an appreciation for the discipline behind the sport. Carriage driving requires patience, control, and deep familiarity with animals and equipment. It rewards individuals who focus quietly on mastering details rather than chasing applause. Those qualities mirror the values Philip himself admired. And after his death, Louise's continued participation in the sport became a powerful symbol of continuity within the family. Spectators at the Royal Windsor Horse Show noticed the significance immediately when she returned to competition using one of Philip's own carriages. For the Queen, watching that moment reportedly carried enormous emotional weight. It represented the preservation of something deeply personal to her late husband. But perhaps most importantly, Louise represents something the monarchy increasingly needs. A generation raised with humility. Unlike some royal children who grow up surrounded by intense media attention, Louise experienced a childhood that balanced royal heritage with normal life. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, made a conscious effort to ensure their children understood the responsibilities that accompany privilege. Louise attended school with ordinary classmates. She held a summer job working at a garden center. And she entered university with the same expectations as any other student pursuing academic goals. For Queen Elizabeth, these experiences likely reinforced the belief that Louise understood something essential about royal service. That the monarchy ultimately exists to serve the public, not the other way around. Which brings us back to the intriguing question at the center of this story. If the Queen truly directed part of her private estate, or personal heirlooms, toward Lady Louise, what message might she have intended to send? The answer may lie in how Elizabeth viewed legacy. Throughout her reign, the Queen repeatedly emphasized that the monarchy's strength comes from its ability to adapt without losing its identity. That balance requires leaders who understand tradition but are not consumed by ambition. Louise appears to represent that balance perfectly. She carries the Windsor bloodline. She respects the customs that shaped the royal family. Yet she shows little interest in personal fame. For a monarch who spent decades observing the pressures of royal life, those qualities would have been incredibly reassuring. And that may explain why the quiet granddaughter who once sketched animals in Balmoral's gardens could now be connected to one of the most intriguing inheritance stories in the modern monarchy. Because while the crown itself passes through a clearly defined line of succession, the spirit of a royal dynasty is often preserved by individuals who stand just outside that line. People who protect traditions without seeking power. People who maintain the character of the institution quietly. And that is exactly the role many royal observers now believe Louise could play. Especially as the monarchy enters a new era under King Charles and prepares for the eventual reign of Prince William. If the Windsor dynasty hopes to maintain public trust in the decades ahead, it will need figures who embody stability rather than spectacle. And among the younger generation of royals, few individuals currently reflect that philosophy as naturally as Lady Louise Windsor. Which may explain why Queen Elizabeth's final private decisions continue to fascinate royal watchers. Because the monarch who guided Britain through 70 years of history may have quietly identified someone capable of protecting the traditions she spent her life defending. But the most surprising part of this story may still lie ahead. Because if Louise's connection to the Queen's private legacy continues to grow, one final question becomes impossible to ignore. Could the quiet granddaughter who once stood far from the center of royal attention eventually become one of the most trusted figures in the next generation of the monarchy? And the answer to that question may determine how the Windsor family writes its next chapter. The quiet legacy that may define the next royal generation. In the long history of the British monarchy, power has never been defined solely by the crown. Yes, the throne determines who becomes sovereign. Titles determine hierarchy. Protocol determines public roles. But behind those formal structures, there has always been something far more subtle shaping the future of the royal family. Legacy. And when it comes to the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II, the story may ultimately reveal far more about the people she trusted than the titles they held. Because after 7 decades on the throne, the Queen understood something most observers rarely see. The individuals who quietly preserve royal traditions are often just as important as those who inherit the crown. Which brings us back to the figure at the center of this unfolding story. Lady Louise Windsor. For much of her life, Louise existed on the outer edges of public awareness. While media attention focused intensely on senior royals like Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, and the broader future of the monarchy, Louise continued living a remarkably private life. She attended school quietly. She worked ordinary part-time jobs. She pursued university studies without attempting to transform her royal status into celebrity. And for many years, that low profile meant the public rarely considered her role within the larger royal narrative. But inside the royal household, her presence may have carried far greater meaning. Because the late Queen's relationship with Louise reflected something deeply personal. Not protocol. Not politics. Family. During summers at Balmoral, Elizabeth often appeared most relaxed when surrounded by grandchildren who treated her simply as a grandmother rather than a monarch. Those moments allowed her to escape the relentless expectations that accompanied her position. And Louise, by all accounts, offered exactly that kind of normality. She asked questions. She listened. She shared quiet interests like drawing and observing the wildlife around the estate. These small moments created a bond that grew stronger over the years. At the same time, Louise developed another meaningful connection within the family through her relationship with Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Through carriage driving, Philip passed on not only technical skills but also a philosophy of discipline and patience. The sport requires careful attention, emotional control, and deep respect for tradition, qualities Philip valued throughout his life. Louise embraced those lessons completely. By the time she began competing in carriage driving events, she had earned genuine respect within the community, not simply because of her royal background, but because of her dedication to the craft. When Philip passed away, the symbolic transfer of his carriage driving equipment to Louise carried enormous emotional weight. It represented the continuation of something deeply personal to the Duke. And perhaps, in a quiet way, it also signaled how the older generation of the royal family viewed her character. Someone capable of protecting traditions. Someone capable of carrying forward history without demanding recognition. Which brings us to the intriguing possibility that has captured the attention of royal observers. If Queen Elizabeth truly directed parts of her personal estate or heirlooms toward Louise, the decision may reveal something profound about how the monarch viewed the future of her family. Because Elizabeth had spent decades watching how different personalities responded to the pressures of royal life. Some sought attention. Some struggled with expectations. Others quietly adapted. Louise appeared to belong to the final category. And that distinction may have mattered greatly to a monarch who believed the survival of the monarchy depended on stability rather than spectacle. As the institution now moves forward under King Charles III, the next generation of royals will gradually take on greater responsibility. At the center of that transition stands Prince William, whose eventual reign will shape the monarchy's direction for decades. But even future kings rely on trusted figures within their family. People who provide support, continuity, and quiet strength behind the scenes. Historically, those roles have often been filled by relatives who stand just outside the direct line of succession. Figures like Princess and/or Prince Edward built reputations for steady service without seeking the spotlight. Lady Louise may represent the beginning of that same pattern for the next generation. Her upbringing emphasized humility. Her interests reflect tradition. And her personality appears naturally suited to the calm, steady approach the monarchy increasingly needs. If she eventually chooses to take on a greater role within the royal family's public life, She could become one of the most trusted supporting figures of the William era. Not a future queen, but perhaps something just as valuable. A guardian of royal continuity. And that possibility may explain why the whispers surrounding Queen Elizabeth's private inheritance decisions continue to fascinate royal watchers. Because inheritance inside royal dynasties has always carried symbolic meaning. It reveals who the monarch believed could be trusted to protect the family's legacy long after the crown itself changes hands. Whether the rumored estate truly passed to Louise or not, one fact already seems clear. The quiet granddaughter who once walked unnoticed through the gardens of Balmoral now occupies a far more intriguing position within the Windsor story than anyone expected. And in a monarchy built on centuries of tradition, the individuals who quietly preserve those traditions often become the most important figures of all. Which raises one final question. As the royal family enters a new chapter under King Charles and prepares for the eventual reign of Prince William, could the future stability of the monarchy depend not only on the next king, but also on the quiet strength of the granddaughter Queen Elizabeth trusted most? If you enjoyed this deep royal insight, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more untold royal family stories, hidden palace decisions, and the secrets shaping the future of the monarchy. And tell us in the comments, do you think Lady Louise could become one of the most important figures of the next royal generation?